All right, today we are cracking open a historical cold case file. This is a story so radical, so out there that it was nearly erased from the history books. We're going to dive into a mystery that swirls around one of the most important figures in all of Western history. So let me start by asking you this. Just roll it around in your head for a second. What if the letters attributed to the Apostle Paul, the ones that literally shaped our world for 2,000 years, what if they were actually forgeries? I know it sounds nuts, but that question is at the very heart of a fascinating and almost completely forgotten scholarly investigation. Okay, so here's the official story. For pretty much as long as we've had modern history, there's been a consensus. Even the most critical, most skeptical scholars out there, they pretty much all agree that Paul of Tarsus was a real guy. And he wrote at least 7 of the letters in the New Testament. These are called the undisputed letters. And they're like the bedrock of everything we think we know about early Christianity. But what if that bedrock was actually made of sand? This is where our cold case really kicks off. Because back in the late 19th century, a group of really well-respected university professors, I'm talking the real deal, they looked at all the same evidence and came to a jaw-dropping conclusion that not one single letter was real, and that the story of Paul we all know was just a later invention. So who were these historical detectives? These weren't some random conspiracy theorists. Not at all. They were an actual, formal school of thought. And let me tell you, they were not afraid to ask the biggest, most uncomfortable questions you can imagine. So let's meet them. They got the name the Dutch Radical School. And that name, which was probably thrown at them as an insult at first, was actually perfect. They were radical because they wanted to dig all the way down to the very, very roots of Christianity and question, well, everything. And this quote right here from one of their main guys, A.D. Lohman, it just sums up their whole vibe. For them, radical wasn't a bad word. It was their job description. It meant you had to be willing to do heroic operations and drastic interventions to find the historical truth, no matter how much it shook things up. And here's the main crew. You had Allard Pearson. He was the guy who basically lit the fuse. A.D. Lohman was the big brain, the intellectual force. Willem von Manning was the workhorse, the guy who just churned out massive books defending their ideas. And then you have G.J. Boland, who took all their critical work and said, okay, let's try to build a whole new history of how this all started. So what was their case? Why on earth did they think this huge forgery had happened? It wasn't just one thing. They built their argument like detectives at a crime scene, looking at the evidence from all these different angles. So clue number 1 for them was that the story, just as it's told in the letters, was, well, kind of unbelievable from a historical point of view. And they put their magnifying glass right on the epistle to the Galatians, which is funny because that's the one most people think is the most authentic and personal of Paul's letters. Pearson came up with this brilliant analogy to explain the problem. He said, look, if you read Galatians, Paul claims that right after his big conversion, he deliberately avoids going to Jerusalem to meet the actual apostles, the people who really knew Jesus. Instead, he just goes off into the desert for 3 years, says he got all his info from a personal revelation, and then just shows up and expects to be treated as an authority. Pearson's point is, that's insane. It's like a huge Socrates fan ignoring Plato to go meditate somewhere, then coming back and saying he's the world expert on Socrates. It just doesn't add up historically. All right, on to clue number 2. This one's all about the writing itself. The radicals argue that the letters are stuffed with anachronisms. Basically, ideas and phrases from books that were written way, way later. For them, this was the smoking gun. It proved the letters had to be forgeries from the 2nd century, not real letters from the 1st. They got really specific about it too. They made a whole case that the writer of these Pauline letters clearly knew about and borrowed from the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts, books that most scholars agree were written after Paul would have died. They also found dozens of similarities in language and ideas to the Roman philosopher Seneca. And, maybe the biggest one, they said the letters were just drenched in Gnostic ideas and language, stuff from these mystical Christian groups that really only blew up in the 2nd century. The timeline just didn't work for them. Their final big clue had to do with how the letters are put together. When the radicals read them, they didn't see a single person writing a clear letter. They saw something stranger, like a bunch of different scraps and fragments all stitched together into a kind of patchwork quilt. This comparison really gets to what they were saying. Think about a real letter you'd write. It's for a specific person or group, right? It has a consistent flow. But in the Pauline letters, the author seems to be talking to Jews and then Gentiles, sometimes in the same breath. The tone shifts all over the place. They'll go from really simple advice to this incredibly dense theology without any warning. The radicals argued these aren't letters at all. They're collections of other sources, tracts maybe, that some editor much later wove together and slapped the name Paul on. So if you're going to say the whole official story is a fiction, you kind of have to offer something in its place, right? Well, the Dutch radicals didn't just tear things down. They used what they found to build a completely different and, honestly, a pretty mind-bending origin story for Christianity. And the biggest, most complete version of this new story came from G.J.P.J. Boland. He basically said, hey, everyone's looking in the wrong place. He argued the real story of Christianity doesn't start in Palestine with a historical man named Jesus. No, it starts in the great intellectual melting pot of the ancient world, Alexandria, in Egypt. So here's how Boland's theory works. Step 1. In Alexandria, you get this mix of Jewish and Greek philosophy that creates a myth. It's about a spiritual redeemer, a Christos, which means the good one. But this is just an idea, not a person. Step 2. This myth travels to Rome. And in Rome, the church organizers realize that a high-minded spiritual idea is too abstract for most people. If you want to build a big, powerful global church, you need a story. So they historicize the myth. They give the Christos a name, Jesus, and a whole life story set in Palestine. And then, step 3, how do you sell this new religion? You create propaganda. You write these tracts disguised as letters from a legendary founding apostle named Paul to make this new faith seem legitimate and to spread the ideas. So for Boland, Paul and his letters weren't the start of Christianity. They were a marketing tool created much later. I mean, that is a breathtaking theory. It really is. But it brings up a pretty obvious question, doesn't it? If this group of serious scholars came up with such a detailed, massive challenge to one of the most important figures in history, why have most of us never even heard of them? So why did the Dutch radical school just kind of fade away? I mean, their books were dense, their arguments were complicated, for sure, but the main reason is actually a lot simpler. At the end of the day, their conclusions were just too much, way too extreme, denying all of the letters, and for some of them even questioning if Jesus existed at all. That was a bridge too far, even for the most progressive scholars of the time. The powerhouse of biblical studies back then was in Germany, and they basically just ignored the Dutch radicals. They called their work adventurous or fantasies and just refused to even engage with it. The radicals were effectively canceled, written right out of the history of their own field. But not everybody dismissed them. The great theologian and philosopher Albert Schweitzer, even though he didn't agree with their conclusions, he paid them this incredible compliment. He saw this immense value in what they did because they refused to accept the easy answers. They were the ones who kept asking the really tough questions when everyone else had decided the case was closed. And that's really the big takeaway from this whole historical cold case, isn't it? The Dutch radicals, they might have been wrong about their answers, sure, but maybe they were profoundly right about the importance of asking fearless questions. And it leaves you with one last thing to think about. What comfortable ideas do we take for granted today? What settled histories in science and politics, in anything, might look totally different if only we had the guts to ask some truly, truly radical questions? Thanks for joining me on The Explainer.